Okay, here's the rest of the video.
Strength of Kennan was his awareness that the Russia in which we were living, Stalin's Soviet Russia, communism, people called it, actually drew in very many ways upon the Russian past.
I had to go right back to page 1 and to try to tell them things that I felt they'd forgotten during the war. This all hangs together with this whole question that this was the same group of people who had dealt with Hitler, tried to deal with Hitler at our expense, and never had changed their views about us.
Kennan's Moscow embassy cable became history, an 8,000-word prophecy that the Soviet Union was in the mood to expand across the world and must be contained.
The day that telegram was drafted, I unfortunately or fortunately had the night duty at the code room and was rather perturbed about it because I happened to have a very heavy date that night. There was a dance at one of the other embassies and I wanted to get out as early as possible. About 6:30 or 7, George comes walking in with this 6-part cable which he wants to send out. And I took a look at it and said it was nice, but let's not send it out. Let's wait till tomorrow. And I tried to talk him into not sending it. He said, Washington wants it, they're going to get it, and you stay here and do it.
Kennan's telegram alarmed Washington. Days later, its message was reinforced when Churchill arrived in the United States as President Truman's guest.
They began to get to know each other. Mr. Fred, our president, said to Mr. Churchill, I will be on this trip quite a while, and I would be glad if you would call me Harry. Well, Mr. Churchill said, I'll be glad to, if you will call me Winston. Mr. Truman said, I don't believe I can do that. He said, I consider you the first citizen in the world, and I just don't believe I can call you Winston. Winston Churchill said, if you can't call me Winston, then I can't call you Harry. The president said, on that basis, we'll do it. So it went to Winston and Harry from that time, and they got on very well.
Churchill was due to speak to a college audience at Fulton, in Truman's home state. Privately, he showed Truman what he was going to say. The president, not sure that the American public was ready for an attack on its wartime Soviet ally, let Churchill test the water.
Mr. Churchill, he's one of the great men of the age. He's a great Englishman. He's a great Englishman, but he's half American.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Except in the British Commonwealth and in the United States, where communism is in its infancy, the Communist parties, or fifth columns, constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts, in fact they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Immediately after that, Stalin came out with answers to a foreign correspondent's questions, in which he compared Churchill to Hitler and decried Churchill's speech as a belligerent call to arms against Soviet Russia.
Okay, so between the first part of this and the second part of this, how do we get to where we are? Stalin calling Churchill Hitler, Churchill arguing that the Soviets want to take over the world, Kennan's understanding of the telegram. There's a lot going on in here. Take just a few minutes, talk with each other about this, and then we're going to move on. The last two pieces I want you to see is how the Soviets tried to move against Turkey and against Greece and what happens there. And then I want you to see the full effect of containment and the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so hopefully you didn't take too much time doing that. Let us continue with seeing how the Soviets want to take over or have access to parts of Turkey that alarms the Allies, and also what happens in Iran, which will set the stage a little bit for what we're going through now. Okay, if for some reason you guys run out of time in class and you can't finish this at home on your own. Okay, so let's watch this piece.
Since 1945, America had been extending its influence and power all over the world. Stalin grew nervous. He put pressure on Turkey to grant the Soviet Union a military presence in the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. America and Britain feared a threat to the Suez Canal. They were determined to keep Turkey free of Soviet interference. When the Turkish ambassador in Washington died suddenly, Truman used America's biggest battleship, the USS Missouri, to deliver the body to Istanbul.
This was a symbol to Stalin. Don't push us, and don't push Turkey, because if you push Turkey, we'll be there.
Iran, like Turkey, lay on the southern borders of the Soviet Union, and for centuries had been hostile to Russia. During the war, Soviet and British troops had occupied Iran to protect their oil supplies. They even celebrated their partnership there. The old Shah, thought to be pro-German, was dethroned and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. There was an agreement that once the war was over, the British and Soviet troops would both pull out.
When the occupation was due to end, Stalin didn't want to leave.
У Сталина охоты уходить из Ирана не было. Он, так сказать,
He wanted to stay on.
И задержаться бы еще. И тут, конечно,
This created problems.
всякого рода сложности.
There was lots of pressure put on us.
Конечно, нажим
Pressure from the British.
англичан большой.
And in fact, the Soviet Union had no legal right to stay there.
Таких легальных, законных у Советского Союза не было.
Iran presented the Security Council of the newly founded United Nations with its first crisis.
Совета Безопасности, вот уже второй день.
That's Mr. Gromyko proposing to the Security Council that the hearing of the Persian case should be postponed.
The Soviet Union tried to prevent further discussion. They lost.
Mr. Gromyko and the other Russians then walked out. Their dramatic exit seems to have caused no obvious reaction at the time, though we can imagine what most of those present were thinking. One good thing, however, emerges from this incident. The Security Council had stood its ground.
6 weeks later, Stalin ceremonially withdrew his forces from Iran. But Truman, shaken by his behavior, suspected that Stalin was aiming at world domination.
He said, I want to be in position to document our concern. Go back over the recent agreements and list one by one the violations in which the Soviets have engaged.
I was then Mr. Clifford's assistant, and he turned the task over to me. We talked about it a bit, and I said, well, it seems to me that that's only scratching the surface. A list of agreements broken. There are much more fundamental problems in our relations with the USSR than that. So let's go at it in a somewhat broader way.
We spent weeks on it then, interviewed most of the top officials in the United States.
There was absolute unanimity in all of the agencies concerned as to the nature of problems we had and the kind of response we were going to have to make.
We ended up the report by saying the policy of our country should be set and clearly set. The Soviet Union constitutes a real menace to freedom in this world. Freedom in Europe, freedom in the United States. So we must prepare for it.
All right. So we do prepare for it. And that's going to be our last segment. I trust you guys are observing and seeing the change over time. This whole day has been a change over time day. When with the start of the war at 41, and now it's only 46, 47, okay? Why can Truman feel like he can push Stalin in 46 and 47? Why can he push, he sends the USS Missouri, don't push us. Why? They're just as powerful. What's the thing that Truman's got that Stalin doesn't? Give some thought to that, okay? All right, we're going to switch to the last piece, which clearly outlines the Truman Doctrine that you should have read about. All right.
Aid to Germany cost Britain over $1 million a day. But British supplies were not enough to save thousands of Germans who died that winter for lack of food and fuel. Britain, too, was weakening. The fierce winter of 1946-47 brought industry to a standstill. The country's economy, undermined by 6 years of war, began to seize up. Coal ran out, electricity failed, and food rationing grew even tighter.
You know, people forget again, we never had bread rationing during the war. We had bread rationing after it. And that was because we were pouring wheat into Germany to prevent mass starvation there.
That was a bad winter altogether. It was cold and the crops were bad. People were unhappy. And the communists were making strenuous gains here, there, and the other place, particularly in Italy and in France, but also in Germany.
The British could no longer afford all their heavy commitments in the Mediterranean. They told the Americans they intended to pull out.
The message came, and it was flat. It said, Great Britain is withdrawing from both economic aid and military aid to Greece and Turkey.
This simply crystallized the opinions in the executive branch that the United States had to move, and move very, very quickly.
The prospect didn't look good at all for Europe or for the United States or for anybody.
In Washington, President Truman went to Congress. From now on, he announced, the United States would contain the advance of communism anywhere on the globe. This, at last, was the official declaration of the Cold War.
All right, so now you have the actual policy of containment, Truman Doctrine. The World War II basically bankrupts the British. By the end of the war, you see they can't do anything. There's nothing they can do to support it. They are withdrawing all their support, and they're heading back to their island. Europe is in shambles. Communism is starting to make some inroads, which is what we're going to look at next. And that is what we're going to talk about tomorrow, and that is the Marshall Plan. All right? So please have read your documents ahead of time as your homework for the Marshall Plan, and tomorrow we will go through it. Once again, this has been an exercise in change over time. This is very similar to what you have to do on a DBQ. Think about it, okay? You've had an opportunity here to listen to primary sources and evaluate the change. And the question is, do you still think America, or do you think America was responsible? Does America overreact? Do the Soviets play a role? Do the British play a role? How do we end up with the Cold War? Do you think the Cold War would have happened if Roosevelt was still around and was still president? Questions to think about. All right, hope you have a good day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.